Tony, it's very good to see you, and to see you in what are reasonably familiar surroundings, having been to your house there a few times. But I think this is rather unusual. This is the first time in all of these conversations that I've actually been talking with someone who was at school with me, and indeed was there before me, because you're a bit older than me. So that's a really particularly exciting thing. Tell us a bit. You were born in Manchester, or near Manchester, and then you moved down to London. Was that because your parents changed roles or married again, or?
No, there wasn't. My father died in 1946, about just under 2 years after I was born, and my mother was a school teacher, and she had a daughter by her first marriage and inherited a daughter by my father's first marriage. And the two girls, one went into nursing and one went into teaching down in London. And my mother decided that she'd rather pursue her teaching career, or what was left of it, in North London, and bought a house in Oakwood in Enfield, at the northern end of the Piccadilly line, so she'd be closer to her stepdaughter and daughter. And I was.
Did she teach near there?
Yes, she did. She taught in Tottenham. She taught in Tottenham, and I went to, first of all, to a primary school in Tottenham before I at the age of 11 in 1956 went to stationers in Hornsey.
And when I was there, you were a big boy, as it were. I can remember you being rather good at football and playing what we used to call fives. It wasn't fives as they do in Eton, but it was belting the ball against the wall of the terraces. And
I think that's about as far as my career in football went. I've never really been a team sports player. My exercise has typically been hill walking, and which I still do. So that's the sort of exercise I enjoy.
And then you went from stationers to Oxford, and you were rather interesting. You were one of the earliest bunch of students starting at the brand new St Catherine's College.
Well, St Catherine's College became a college of the University of Oxford in 1962, and I matriculated, went up to Oxford in October 1963. I was the second year, and effectively the first 2 years at college was living on a building site. And what a building it was St Catherine's was designed by the Danish architect Arne Jacobsen, was one of the very first 1960s buildings to be listed grade 1. And it's still an outstanding piece of architecture, and has been added on to very sympathetically over the years. It was an interesting college because the founder, Lord Bullock, Alan Bullock as he then was an historian, but the mission of St Catherine's was to have 50% humanities and 50% science, and I went up to read chemistry.
Well, Bullock himself, of course, was very well known, and I remember reading one day his great double biography of Hitler and Stalin, and I got onto an aeroplane to go to Moscow, and I asked the stewardess if she'd get my book down out of my case, and when she got it down, she said you didn't really need it. She said you needed a separate case just for the book, it was so big.
Well, Bullock was a giant, not only in the historical world, but in the Oxford world. I mean, he was one of the movers and shakers of the 50s and 60s. Indeed.
But then you went on, you stayed at St Catherine's to do your DPhil.
Yes, I was attached to the Atomic Energy Authority at Harwell while I did that, and I joined a research group in the inorganic chemistry laboratory in Oxford. Incidentally, at a time when some of the work that led to John Goodenough's Nobel Prize in Chemistry a couple of years ago was being done, and Dorothy Hodgkin was another star of the chemistry department. It was an unbelievably illustrious period for Oxford chemistry, and I spent most of my time down at what was then the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell. But I decided at the end of that, rather than continue to work for the government, higher education, which I suppose I could have done, I decided that I'd really like to pursue a career in business finance, and joined a graduate training program at Hill Samuel, which was a prominent investment banking organization in the city in the 1960s.
And was it while you were in Oxford, or while you were doing that research, that you met Mary, your wife?
Yeah, Mary was on is Canadian. My wife, Mary, is Canadian, and she was on an teacher exchange program, and she taught multiply handicapped deaf children. And she worked for a year at a unit in Cowley, and it was through one of her colleagues who was married to one of my fellow students in the inorganic chemistry laboratory that led to the introduction. The rest is history. We got married not long after I went down from Oxford, and we've been married just shy of 49 years.
That's marvellous. And then when you got to London to take up a career in finance, I gather you were perhaps the youngest. You were elected to the Common Council in. Well, you were one of the youngest.
Yes, I was one of the youngest. Mary and I, when we got married, had a lease on 204 Mountjoy House in the Barbican, and we were the first occupants of Mountjoy House, and we found ourselves in Aldersgate without a ward. And we had a contested election, which didn't happen very often in those days in the city. And I was elected, and I served 2 years on the Court of Common Council. The critical point when the Barbican was being built and paid for, which was an interesting challenge at that time. But then my business career took me increasingly to the United States. And in 1977, I eventually left Britain to spend the next 14 years of my life in the United States, in Texas, in Houston, Texas.
And you were doing a job then, still in finance, was it? But
Yeah.
But related to the oil industry in some way.
The oil and gas, and in particular, oil and gas services and equipment. So not the oil itself, but all the services and equipment that was needed to extract oil, drilling rigs, supply boats, electronic equipment, all that kind of stuff. And we were, you may not remember, but the 1980s was a very turbulent time for the oil and gas industry, where the price shot up after the Gulf Wars and then dropped back again, and caused an awful lot of financial distress. And that's how I got to start working in the field of corporate rescues and corporate restructurings. That was during the mid-1980s in Houston.
And am I right in remembering that you had, you and Mary, for a time anyway, had a ranch somewhere in America?
Well, I still have a share in a working ranch out in Utah. I don't get to see it very often, but bought it with my partners, and it does nothing but absorb cash. It's not been a particularly lucrative investment, but it's been nice to have as effectively a timeshare on a ranch in southern Utah, just north of the north rim of the Grand Canyon, just in Utah. Wonderful place. I wish I could get to it more often.
It sounds amazing. And then when you came back, is that when you had that the house in what was the old Sarson's Vinegar Factory in Kennington? Or
the back house in off Fenton Road in Vauxhall, which I still own, believe it or not. I still own it. It still gets used. It's a lovely apartment, and as you say, it's the top floor of the Sarson's Vinegar Factory.
And then tell us when you bought the east wing of Calallen Castle.
Well, you may know that I've always been interested in historic buildings, and and we knew Calallen was separated. The castle and the grounds were separated from the estate in 1986 and bought by an architect developer called Kit Martin, who is very well known in restoration circles. And he had devoted his career at that time to finding new uses for country houses that were in trouble. And a large country house in Northumberland in the mid-1980s was definitely a liability. And Mary and I saw this for sale, in a unit for sale, the east wing of Calallen for sale, while we're sitting reading our Saturday newspaper in Houston. And we decided to go ahead and buy it. Initially, it was a holiday home while we were living and working in America. But Kit Martin made a specialty at that point of dividing up large rambling country houses that were bankrupting the owners, which that was what was happening to Calallen. And, you know, we all feel that we've sort of saved one of the great listed buildings in Northumberland. It's a lovely place to live. You have all the advantages of living in a large country house and relatively few of the disadvantages.
Yes, and I remember I knew Kit Martin quite well when I was living in Norfolk. His wife was, she had her own aeroplane and used to enjoy buzzing around. And his father was the same Professor Martin who designed the Festival Hall. Yes,
that's right. Yeah. And Kit Martin's home was at Gunton Park in Norfolk. And we knew somebody who lived at Dingley in Northamptonshire, not far from Market Harborough, in Kettering, and that we were very keen and enthusiastic on doing that, and we bought it in 1988, and it's a decision I've never regretted. I love Northumberland, where my roots are now, to the extent that in a county like Northumberland, someone from the outside can never put roots down, really.
Well, yes, that's true. But and am I right in remembering that the part of Calallen Castle that you live in was once the ballroom, or part of it was?
It was originally built. Calallen was between the early 13th century and 1877. Was owned by the Clavering family, who one of the great recusant families of Northumberland. And the wing that we own was built in, the foundations of it were built in 1750 and became a Catholic chapel. It was a Roman Catholic chapel. When the house was sold and the estate sold in 1877, the last Clavering, Lady Augusta Clavering, who became Lady Augusta Bedingfeld and lived at Oxborough in your territory in Norfolk. They built a Catholic church for the congregation in the village, not very far, and then the new Brown owners pulled down the chapel, at least the upper part of it, to create a ballroom. The underneath beneath the ballroom is the undercroft of the chapel, which now serves as the wine cellar.
Yes, that's right. I remember that now. Yes. So, when you also, another thing I remember was that back in the 90s, I suppose it would be, you were for a period the Conservative candidate for the constituency of Berwick-on-Tweed.
Indeed, I was. Indeed, I was. In fact, it was ahead of the 1992 general election. The Conservative Party did indeed have a candidate in place, but the candidate in place fell out with the Constituency Association, and at the last minute, they found themselves without a candidate and asked whether I would do that, which I did, which I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I didn't win, actually, but I'm glad I didn't win. But it was a very interesting experience, and people will tell you that if you've stood for parliamentary office, it does change you. You respect the power of electorates and the wishes of electorates in a funny way that you can't do unless you've been a candidate.
And rather interestingly, of course, your opponent, who only retired, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, was Alan Beath, who was very popular in the county, wasn't he?
He's a very good friend. Alan's a very good friend. I mean, it's hard not to like Alan, and
yeah.
I mean, it's impossible not to like Alan. And you know, he lost his second wife recently, and he lost his first wife not long before I really came to be the candidate and got to know. Yeah, I mean, Alan was also, I worked with Alan when he was chairman of the Historic Chapels Trust, and managed to bring Biddleston Chapel, which is another ancient recusant place of worship, into the arms of the Historic Chapels Trust, which at that time was chaired by Alan Beath, no less.
And I gather you still have, in fact, I think I've seen him, a Norwich Terrier. The successor of Atwood and various other ones.
Yes. apart from Atwood, which is my Mary's, we have Norwich Terriers. They're all named after 19th century prime ministers. So we've had a Gladstone, a Disraeli. This current one I've got is called Bobby. His kennel name is Peel, but we call him Bobby for short. And we've had a Wellington called Boot, and then if there is another one, he'll be called Pitt.
Well, Tony, I suppose we ought to be drawing to a close, but the thing I haven't really asked you is, did you join the company as a Freeman soon after you left school, or is that much more recent?
That's much more recent. That was when the door was open, and I owe a lot to Stationers School, and I remember going down to Stationers Hall, and I selected out from my bookcase this morning. This is one of my possessions. It's the company's prize, which was presented to me by the master of the company in November 1963, halfway through my first term, and it's the company's prize, and it's signed by Robert Baines. Both of us owe a great deal to Robert Baines.
We do.
He's responsible. I'm not going to go into details. He used to take school parties up to Coverdale, and that's how I got to love the Pennines and eventually the Cheviot. And Robert Baines is probably the reason why I currently live in Northumberland. But I owe a great deal to Robert, and that's a very precious book. It's a standard book on physical chemistry that was the standard work during the 1960s and early 1970s. But it's a real precious. It was then stamped with the coat of arms of the Stationers Company and signed by Robert Baines, and there's the company's prize for.
Great, and I celebrated the Requiem when Robert died, but that's a very good place to finish, I think, because we've actually sort of finished with Stationers where you and I first met. So thank you so much, Tony, for giving us this opportunity for a really, really interesting conversation about a fascinating life.
Good. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope we have a catch-up call, another catch-up call before too long.
Absolutely.
Okay.